couple of years ago, my friend Kate had asked me to go with her to a party. This party was being thrown by her friend Susan. Kate had gone to a Catholic school with Susan in elementary and middle school, but during high school, Kate ended up going to a public school where she met me, while Susan went to a Catholic high school. The two had grown apart somewhat and hung out with different people, which is why Kate invited me along. It was Susan's birthday, and apparently, Susan's parents had decided to rent out a cabin for her. They did this the previous year, and unbeknownst to them, she had decided to throw a party. The party had been a hit last time, so she was planning on doing it again. Kate and I drove to the cabin together, and it was pretty isolated, aside from the woods behind it. There wasn't anything around. We couldn't even see the other cabins, but I imagined they would probably be empty because it was winter time. At first I was a little apprehensive because I wasn't going to know anyone at the party, but I figured after a few drinks that wouldn't really bother me anymore. Also, if you watch scary movies, you know that having a party in a cabin in the woods is a horror movie cliché. I was very aware of that. Kate and I had even been joking about how attending this party sounded like a prelude to a horror film. As if that wasn't enough, this was a Catholic schoolgirl party. We arrive at the cabin, and it is pitch black outside. We needed to use our phones just to find our way. We go inside, and everything seems fine. The birthday girl is having a great time, and there was a good amount of people. The odd thing is that there seems to be a strange sort of divide at the party. Kate and I were completely unaware of what was happening. I did happen to know this guy, though, who had the name of the city we lived in tattooed in a messy scrawl across his neck. Kate and I had been silently laughing about it, but we were also a little worried because we wondered if that meant he was in a gang or something. Anyways, I don't remember why, but the main group of the party wanted these people to leave. I think it had to do with them drinking a lot despite not having brought any alcohol of their own. So, in order to get these people to go, the main group said that a ranger or whoever was coming to stop by, that there was only supposed to be like 2 cars by the cabin and a handful of people. The rumor was that one of the guys in the group was on probation and couldn't afford to get in trouble. So they left, and the plan was a success. Or so we thought. Just as the group leaves, there were about 4 or 5 guys and 1 girl. The girl comes back in and says, "I just want to tell the birthday girl happy birthday," in a really loud voice, drawing everyone's attention. Everyone was staring at her in confusion, like why was she announcing this so awkwardly, when not even 2 seconds later, you hear a window in one of the back rooms being busted open. This continues, and more windows are being broken, and people are shouting and screaming. I'm just sitting there in confusion. Kate and I had been at this party for all of 15 minutes before all hell broke loose, and the girl who invited the group of hoodlums is now saying that she knows at least one of them has a gun. I don't know if my mind wasn't processing all of this correctly or what, but I'm just sitting there thinking, well, this is happening. The majority of us remained in the cabin. A couple of people went outside to see if the group was still there, and after a little bit of time had passed, people began to leave. There was still some fear that those guys might be out there waiting, but a lot of people just wanted to get out. I remember 3 girls who had been planning on staying the night had gathered all their stuff up with their arms full and began heading out the door. As soon as all 3 walk out, we hear screaming coming from the woods, and all 3 girls immediately turn around and walk right back in. In retrospect, it was kind of funny. One of the girls proceeds to start crying, though. Luckily, the scream had only been that of a new girl arriving at the party. She had seen her friend outside and had screamed in excitement. Kate and I had stayed at the cabin for a couple more hours. We really didn't want to leave Susan alone, and the majority of people had left at this point, aside from us. There were only a couple of people left in the cabin. Thankfully, those people were staying the night, so Kate and I were able to leave around 2 a.m. We had all debated calling the cops, but considering the underage drinking going on, no one really wanted to. Plus, Susan was worried about her parents finding out about the party, and had decided she was just going to lie about how the windows had been broken. Thankfully, the group of potentially dangerous people did not return. While that night had been scary, all I can really focus on was the fact that this took place at a cabin in the middle of the woods, at a party thrown by Catholic schoolgirls. I was 11 when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Belle, my younger sister, was 8. My dad was a freelance programmer. When I was younger, he made great money on his jobs, but because he was heavily in debt, at least 500 plus, and my mom was not the most gifted person at balancing a budget, we never had much free money available. This meant that we went on a vacation once every few years, and usually that was to a relative's house. My dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion with a new movie, Final Destination, because my dad loved watching scary stuff and scaring the daylights out of my sisters and me. We were in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it and came back to grab Mom while we kept watching the movie. Belle took the opportunity to pause the film and take Duchess, our dog, captive because she was scared. They came back about 10 minutes later and announced that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't know what to make of that, but apparently, the client he had been helping owned a nice cabin by a lake in the mountains and had offered to let us lodge there this weekend for a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so Mom went into a panic frenzy of packing, so we didn't get to see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed to the mountains. It was a 2-hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and went exploring in the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a little nook thing you could climb up to that was about head height, 3 feet tall, and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for the 3 of us to hang in and play games. There were a few dozen board games up there, so we started playing once we decided on the rooms. Mom and Dad got the large one, and Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Belle and I got the last room, which had a queen-sized bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed without a curtain and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the room, and there was a closet opposite the bed. It was locked, and we couldn't get in it for some reason. I never did find out what was in there. We went to bed at around 11 p.m. Belle can be a kicker in her sleep, so I slept by the lamp in case she ended up knocking it over. I remember lying down, and I must have instantly fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Belle was gripping my arm and trying to burrow under me. She was squeaking something in fright, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I sat up and looked towards her, and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took several moments to process that, then I was shooting out of bed and dragging Belle with me. We rushed to our parents, who told us we were imagining things. Mom told us to go back to bed, and if we saw anything else to let them know. I, much to my current annoyance, agreed with them and went back in the room with Belle. We switched positions because she refused to go back to bed by the window. I told her a story to get her to sleep, and I promptly knocked myself out after her. I didn't wake up until morning. The next day we went exploring around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we spend the day in the town. They had a lot of small shops, and my parents went to every one of them. We ate lunch and dinner in the town, and finally, we went back to the cabin. Ariel made a joke about something as we neared the cabin, and I remember everybody laughing before my dad suddenly held up his hand to make everyone stop. He took another step towards the cabin and then pushed the door open with a single finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't latched, but I didn't put the obvious together right away. Dad, Ariel, and Belle shuffled near to me, but my dad gave his head a shake to let Ariel know she needed to be quiet. He went into the cabin and disappeared inside for a minute or two, while we stood on the porch. Mom called out his name, and he called back that we could come inside. We did and found him standing in the middle of the living room with a frown. He locked the door once we were all inside and took Mom to the bedroom for a quick chat. Ariel, having caught on to what was happening, opted to distract Belle and me by suggesting another round of the board game that we had been playing the night before. We hadn't been playing for more than 5 minutes when Mom and Dad came back. Mom went about cleaning the dishes from breakfast while Dad joined our game. We played for a few hours, and Dad told us we needed to go to bed. It was only 9 at that point, which made Ariel kind of mad. She was usually allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights and even later on weekends and vacation. Belle and I went to bed while they argued. We climbed back into the same spots we slept in, with Belle by the window and me by the lamp. I read to her for a bit before we drifted off. I woke up to Dad rushing in our room. He scooped Belle out of the bed and grabbed my hand. He dragged me out of the room and into the hall, where I saw Ariel getting similar treatment by my mom. I became aware of a high-pitched whine in the living room, and I saw our dog sitting by the back door. She was bristled and seemed anxious. Dad didn't put Belle down and didn't let go of my hand. They rushed out of the house and into the van. Dad went back to get our dog, and then he burned rubber getting out of the cabin. He drove all the way back home without talking once. It took a half hour for Duchess to finally calm down. He told Ariel what happened the next day, but Belle and I didn't find out until years later. He'd woken up that night to what sounded like moaning outside the window in his room. He jumped up and looked to see what was going on, and he found that the front door was unlocked. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess started to growl at the back door, which was ajar. He locked it and got us out of the house. He went back the next day to get our luggage and found several pairs of footprints outside Belle's and my window. This is a true story. Every time I tell it, it captures the eyes of everyone in the room. So in the summer of 2020, my friends Alex and Violet and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. Cabin fever had hit us hard and we were desperate to get out. We settled on a mountain estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Alex's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet brought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, and it was tucked in their bag. As we pulled out of the driveway to make our way to the cabin, I remember the knot in the pit of my stomach, like this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way we could drop acid this night. Violet was pretty angry. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled, and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled towards the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites, just a long winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm as dusk gave way to night. We heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road, then saw the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived, and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, climbed the fire tower, and left. We had heard previously that there might be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside. We cooked some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast, and sat in silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you're in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to the white noise living in the city because there's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. But here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of your own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another. And finally, I had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, then slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen up, and we were laughing, finally having the fun time that we envisioned. Much more sober than we thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd recall hearing noises in the background, the snap of a twig or the dim rumble of an engine. None of us really wanted to rupture the air of the nonchalance between us, so we ignored it until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it 3 times. We were all screaming in an instant, and Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed poker from the fireplace and passed them around, and Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was or whatever this was would have heard us call 911, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived about 20 minutes later, which was a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing. Though they suggested it might have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We barely cooked those hot dogs, and why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids rather than the one closest to the pan that we used to cook? And also, why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers, but they had one anecdote. As they sped to us, they came across a car at the base of the mountain, but that was the only sign of life that they had seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they had said and dizzied by a new horror. Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by our drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places that we hadn't. We grabbed all of our stuff by the armful and threw it inside, eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain. We followed the police, and we were grateful for every pothole that found us further and further from the wretched cabin. I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember, there was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top, no pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower. Maybe a visitor decided to spook a stern, a late-night excursion. But the kids from earlier, we had seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way because they didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence and secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare because they had planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me, and I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit and calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service because it was certainly a welcome surprise to us.